So we can go to these links and take a look. And this is just information you can see here. This console log statement is also here. And this just kind of goes over all of the drawers in the panel and how they can be used. To open this in Chrome, at least, you can right click and go to inspect, or you can hit a number of key combinations to get in here. And then once you're in here, this console is where information will pop up. So if there are any errors on your page, they'll pop up in here. If there's anything that you're consoling out, it'll pop up in here. And you can actually use this to interact with your page. I can say console.log hello world here, and that will come back to me. So I can actually do a little bit of JavaScript in here if I want to test what it's like to use variables, or if I want to write a real quick function and just see how that works, I can totally do that. And then the console is similar on IE and Firefox, slightly different. It's just best if you kind of pick the browser that you want to develop in the most and get familiar with the developer console. There are other tabs. The network tab is another of my favorites. I'm in here all the time. Anytime there's AJAX stuff going on, those backend HTTP requests, which I know that there are a few of in your projects, they will show up in here. I don't know if anything. Yeah, okay. So you can see at least all of the resources that are being acquired here. This is because I've got it on all. If we go to just XHR, which is the XML HTTP request, it will show you the information that was gathered by the site after the site is loaded. That would apply to your projects as well, such as if you're doing the check for a username. When that request fires off to your PHP, the evidence of that will be in this tab right here. So you can see whether or not that went off. You can see how that responded. So if we go and click on one of these things, you can see a preview of the response here. And then there are other ways to see that too. And these are all the headers. This is the request information that requested made the HTTP request. This is the response information, all of the response headers. Here's more request headers. So you can kind of get a feel for this. But this network tab and the console tab are definitely huge resources for developing web pages. And then also, just well, maybe kind of getting ahead of myself here a little bit, but you can totally actually edit CSS in this. So if I inspect this, I can see how the CSS is, and I can turn things off. I can change stuff. None of this is really doing anything good right now. But you can turn things off, you can change things, and you can try out your CSS ahead of time on your page without having to like save and refresh. So anyway, back to what I was talking about. Are there any questions about the developer console? Anything you'd like to see in that? Okay, moving on. So in PHP, we don't declare variables, we just use them. In JavaScript, we are supposed to declare variables. JavaScript is pretty lenient. It'll let you do things that you're not supposed to do because browsers come in all shapes and sizes. So they try to accommodate old code, new code that may come up. But these are the three basic types of variable declaration. I only put these up here for completeness sake. For your purposes, var is fine. You'll probably see var in most things. I would suggest just using var because there's no weirdness or specific stuff about it. You declare a variable, it's available to be used everywhere. As you journey on with JavaScript, I really suggest using let and const more. I personally use const almost exclusively, but that's a whole conversation we're not going to get into. So var is how you declare variables. You'll see a little bit of that on this slide right here. There are types in JavaScript, but JavaScript is weakly typed, just like PHP is. So you don't have to say that it's a number or it's a string. You just assign whatever to the variable and then operate on it as you like. You can change a variable. that one that's a number right now, if I on the next line set my number to a string 15, then that would update fine. Nobody would complain about that. And then you can see strings, numbers, and arrays all work effectively the same way as in JavaScript. The array syntax here, exactly like in JavaScript, is like my array 0 would give me the value 1, and my array 0, 1, 2 would give me the value 3. Is that clear? Because 0, 1, 2. Yes?
So I assume you can like do something like my array equals my string, and it'd be totally fine with that.
Yes, absolutely. I only name those that for demonstration purposes.
And then like if you did my array, you can't concatenate variables, or can you? It's like if you did my array equals my array plus my string.
You totally can concatenate in JavaScript. It can be somewhat confusing sometimes, but the string concatenation is very straightforward. I actually didn't make a slide about that, but I'm going to go ahead and add one in here because it's a great question. Concatenation, probably not spelled right. E? Okay. So we've got my string 1, and it'll be my name is, and then we've got bar up my string 2 equals.
About, like if you try to do my array one, like if you try to add an array variable plus a string or something.
It will do something.
Okay.
Is the answer to that, but JavaScript makes some assumptions. So we can try it out. We can open up the console here and just see what happens. Ugh. So we've got var array equals 1, 2, 3. Var string equals my name. And we'll do array plus string. So sort of strangely, that turned the array into a comma-separated list and then just tacked on the string afterwards. So JavaScript does weird stuff.
Yeah.
It does. It just does. And there are a bunch of quirks about JavaScript that you would have to get used to if you're going to use JavaScript regularly. Try not to put yourself in those positions. Yeah. Is kind of the
weird edge cases.
Yeah, definitely. All right, I'm going to finish this out just because I started it. So concatenation in here. I am. Is going to be like my string 1 plus my string 2. Those are the worst capitalized ever. Let's fix that. All right. So, and this is concatenation in JavaScript. So plus sign like you might expect. Okay, so moving on, unless there are more questions about variable declaration, strings, numbers. You can also cast in this if you wanted to turn a number into a string. It would be like parse int 15 would give you 15, and wait, is that the other way around? Parse int. I think I just said that backwards. Yeah, I said that backwards. Okay, so parse int string 15 will give you the number 15. Parse float string 15.25 will give you the float of 15.25. So that's just a little bit of casting. Variable casting is a word you should look up if you would like to learn more about that. Okay, so yeah.
Would the parse float take in float, not string?
They take strings and they emit, right?
Because I saw the two strings that when you were on the parsing, so never mind.
Okay, so toString does the opposite. Ah, well. Yeah, so in that case, it'll be like 15.toString, like that. And that'll give you 15. Okay. So object literals is next, and personally, this is like my favorite part of JavaScript. I totally love object literals. May sound like a strange thing to say. It sounded weird as I was saying it, but I really do because they're very easy to work with, and they make up the backbone of one of the most important web technologies today, and that is JSON. JavaScript object notation. If you're familiar with that, then wonderful. If you're not familiar with that, then you really, really should be. Here, I'll add a link to that here. Super readable link. Something. JSON is JavaScript object notation. And that is the string version of these object literals. But anyway, going back to object literals, basically what this is a dictionary array, very similar in PHP to the arrays where you have a word and a value as opposed to a number and a value. So I'm going to open up, a console, I guess. So that's my object literal. Here, I think I actually have another slide that shows some of this stuff a little nicer. Yeah, okay, so here we go. We have this object literal defined here. You can see I'm setting it to a variable, just like any other variable. And then I have two ways of accessing it, because it wouldn't be JavaScript if there wasn't like a dozen ways to do it. We can either use the dot notation, or we can use the array notation. Array notation is going to be really important so that you can do variables. So you could also say var access equals key, and then I could say my obj access, and that would also give me the value. And in that way, you can programmatically move through these object literals. Are there any questions on that? Okay, moving on. Functions. In JavaScript, functions can be treated as variables. They're not super important for you, but a fun fact nonetheless. It supports both named and anonymous functions. We've got here a sort of what I would consider a standard function, probably what you'll be using the most. And that is, function declaration, function name, space for arguments or parameters, whatever you like to call them. And then this block of code is where the code of the function goes. JavaScript functions can take a return statement or not. And if it returns nothing, then it's just an undefined, but it may have a side effect that does something. And then you can also set a function equal to a variable and then pass the function around. You can return functions from functions and pass those around. You can get crazy with JavaScript. JavaScript is a fully functional language, and you can use that for great good or great evil, but I personally find that JavaScript is probably my favorite language to write in. You hear some people say bad things about JavaScript, but you shouldn't let them. Okay, so part of why you find yourself using JavaScript for this class is that we're doing something called DOM manipulation. DOM is an acronym for Document Object Model. That's just what you call it when there's a bunch of XML that makes up a web page. I know HTML isn't XML, but you know what I mean. So there are kind of two ways you can go about DOM manipulation in JavaScript. This second slide here kind of gives you the rundown of the vanilla JavaScript way of doing it. So like without a library, all browsers are capable of finding elements by ID, finding elements by class name, finding a list of elements, things like that. But jQuery is a set of convenience methods that allow you to do that stuff and a bunch of other stuff in a really easy way. There was a time, around the time when I was in this class, that jQuery was the absolute bee's knees. In that time, cross-browser stuff was really bad. I mean, you may remember we looked at the Ajax stuff in this class. We built it up from scratch, and how you had to like be aware of this browser and that browser, and IE has two versions. Well, it was like that for everything, absolutely everything. If you wanted to find a document by its ID, then you got to do it once for Firefox, once for IE, once Netscape was still a thing at that time, so once for those guys. Opera still around, but so it was bad. I mean, it was a dark time, and during those times, this jQuery thing came out, and it was wonderful. You could do everything cross-browser. Somebody else had just written all the bad code for you, and that was great. In time, we've sort of found frameworks that do more for us without making us do so much actual DOM manipulation, and that's really nice. Stuff like Angular or React, not necessary for this class. But the jQuery has sort of fallen by the wayside because ultimately when you get very much going, it can be very difficult to maintain. So over time, we found better ways to maintain it. But for small interactions like what we use on this site, or for projects in this class, jQuery is great. I mean, jQuery is going to get a lot of things done for you very, very quickly. It's very easy to learn and understand. There are a ton of resources out there for learning it. Way easier and faster to get to than something like React or Angular. I mean, those are huge 2 or 3 week projects to just like start going with it. But jQuery, you can have it up and running in no time. So I do recommend that for this class specifically, and for things that you're doing on this project, on these projects. It's not required. It's not required at all, but it is useful if you're trying to get some JavaScript stuff done. This can be a way to cut down on your keystrokes, and which therefore is easier on you, which is great. If you don't want to do that, you just want to go hard mode all the way, which I absolutely admire and maybe just short of suggest. These are the 3 key functions that you'll use: document.getElement by ID, getElements by class name, and query selector all. The first one will return a element, which you can see the documentation for an element here. The second 2 will return what's called a node list, which is not an array, but looks like an array and acts like an array, but is just incredibly memory intensive. And then this third link here is Vanilla.js is not a framework. It is a site dedicated to telling you how you could do the things that jQuery does without using jQuery. So I just included that. If anybody's interested in JavaScript, I do recommend reading through that site because it gives you a lot of information, a lot of insight. So you can make up your mind how you're going to proceed with those things, but that's just information for you. All right, so it's time to move to CSS. Are there any questions about JavaScript, what I've gone over so far? Yeah.
So in the console, you can write anything as JavaScript, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So is the console like coded in JavaScript?
I would guess the answer to that is no. But it is, along with the whole browser, there's a JavaScript engine in there. So V8 is one. I can't remember the names of the other ones off the top of my head, but there's a piece of code sitting inside the browser that is able to read, understand, interpret JavaScript. So that is what's being used,
Okay.
I guess. Okay, so CSS now. First, we're going to talk about how to get CSS into your page. There are 3 levels of CSS, and CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, because these do cascade, meaning that one will take precedent over the other every time. So first, on your first level, your highest tier, and the first one to get overwritten is external. External CSS is something that is in a file that is not in the HTML file. Okay, that's going to be like your .css file. You can see up here this link with the type text/CSS and then the reference to the file itself. Next, we have internal CSS, which is CSS which is at the head of the HTML, and anything that conflicts between what's in the head of the HTML and what's in the external style sheet, the head of the HTML will be taken and the external style sheet will be ignored. An additional comment on that, if anything conflicts within the external style sheet, or say you have multiple external style sheets, then they're read from top down. So the last thing to get read is the thing that is displayed. And that is the same reason why the internal and inline ultimately take precedence. It is because they are the last ones to get read. So internal's up at the head, inside a style tag, and then inline is actually inside the element itself, inside of a style attribute like this. So my preference, personal preference, is to keep everything in external style sheets, do almost no or no internal, and then inline is basically like asking for 6 weeks from now, I don't remember what happened, why is this style still here, I can't make it stop, and then like you eventually read your code and you're like, oh, it's because there's a style deep in this HTML that I forgot about and is messing me up. So just for memory's sake, I find that the external is the best way to go. You will find in your PHP projects that inline CSS can be extremely handy as far as like setting a color here or there. You can do the exact same thing by setting a class name and keeping it in an external sheet. There's no requirements in this class regarding which of these you use. Do what makes the most sense to you in your circumstance, but just my piece of advice to you is to try to default to the external as much as possible. A lot has been written on organizing CSS. It's a very difficult task, very difficult thing to do. I don't have any links about that on here, but I do recommend that you read up on it because people really have done a lot of thinking about it and written a lot about it, and it's worth paying attention to. Yes?
So you said the external takes priority over...
Opposite.
So external is the lowest priority?
External is the lowest priority, but the one that you should default to.
Okay.
In my opinion, on the defaulting part. Not my opinion that it's the lowest priority. That's a fact. Okay, so here we have, well, we'll do more, but three layers of styling these elements. We can address them. So here we have HTML, and then below it we have CSS. I don't know if this is hard to read or difficult to understand. But here we have a div. It doesn't have a class. It doesn't have an ID, but we can still style it by addressing the tag type in general. This has drawbacks, maybe obvious drawbacks, in that now every div on your entire page is going to be styled in the exact same way. Chances are that is not what you want. The next layer is, well, I mean, these don't like cascade in the same way. It's just the next thing on the slide. Is the ID of an element, so you can give an element an ID. And then, oh, whoops, that's not right at all. That is denoted by a hash there. So hash my element will address a ID called my element. Now, the thing with IDs is you can only have one ID. Well, names can't conflict on an HTML page. So once I have an element with the ID my element, I cannot add another element with the ID my element. I mean, I can, but it's going to get confusing because the browser will only address the last one of those. And if you put it into a HTML linter, it will tell you that that is illegal and you should not do that. But as with many things in the browsers, there's no consequences. I mean, aside from it'll be hard on you if you're trying to use that ID in JavaScript. And then the third layer is classes. Classes can be used all over the place. Classes are the best way to address an HTML element because they're the most malleable. If you've got a style on an ID that you like and you want another element to be styled the same way and you try to give it that ID, that's not going to work because only one element per page can have that ID. Much better to define it in the class and then to give both of those elements that same class. And in that way, you can reuse your styles. Any questions on that? Yeah.
So it's my understanding, so if you just do it by elements, then all the divs are going to have the same style. And ID, you can't have more than one of the same ID, but you can have more than one of the same class.
That is correct.
Is that kind of like the gist of that slide?
That is exactly right.
All right.
Any other questions? All right. So now we get into how to use that. I mean, obviously, this is sort of a simple level case, but it can get a lot more complicated. So here we have a div. Can we all see this? Everybody that's looking anyway, I guess. We have a div that is ID'd as my element. It has a class, my class 1, as a sub element, which is a span of class, my class 2. And then there's something in there, but who cares what it is. So we can address this on several different levels. Here we can address my class 1 directly and style all elements with the class my class 1. You can see here there's no space between this. That means that we are looking at all divs that have the class my class 1. So if then there was a span on the page or a form on the page that had the class my class 1, it would not apply. Okay, so this is locking it down to only divs that are classed as my class 1. Here we see there's a space. That's looking for sub-elements. So this is looking for all divs that have a sub-element with the class my class 2. There you go. And then we can put those together and we could lock that down to a div with my class 1 sub-elements with a class my class 2. And there's more than that. I mean, so much more than that. CSS, I feel, does not get the respect that it deserves for being like just a ton of information, so much information that you have to read and memorize and get a feel for. It's so here are all the ways that you can select with HTML or with CSS. Sorry. Obviously, we only went over a couple of those, but there's really only a couple of them that you use in most cases. So for your purposes, I would say, sticking to this level of stuff is probably best. And honestly, if you can keep everything or most things like this, you're going to thank yourself for that. Obviously, sub-elements are going to be required, but getting 3 or 4 levels deep with sub-elements is going to be a a pain for you. You only want to keep it to 1 or 2, 3 at most sublevels, and just reference things back using classes, and be smart about how you use classes, and read up on how people use classes because, like I said, a lot has been written about it. Yeah.
So, so on the second and third lines there, div my class 1 and div space my class 2, does the space mean that it's the subclass? So if you got rid of that space, would it just modify all the divs that have the class my class 2?
Right. So
instead of the subclass, or how does that work?
This one is talking about this element because it is a div that has the class myClass2 actually on it, right? This one is finding this because what it is finding is a div with an element under it named myClass or classed as myClass2.
So that's what the space does?
That's what the space does.
But if you got rid of it, then there wouldn't be a div with the class myClass2. Only a subclass, right?
Right. I mean, there's nothing stopping me from making a div that is classed as myClass2. I could even add it in here, right? So I could say, because you can have as many classes as you want within reason. There's probably a limit to it. So I can do this, and that would change the nature of this a bit. Well, it wouldn't. None of these would hit this one as myClass2 because there's nothing that's looking at myClass2 specifically, right? And the only one that is looking for myClass2 requires that there be a div above it. So by putting that myClass2 in here, I'm actually not changing anything about how this CSS is done. Does that make sense?
Kind of. Yeah.
So if there was another definition in here that was similar to this one, then that would be applying to this div,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
But there's no div outside of this, so this one does not apply. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, so that third line, or the second from the bottom, just doesn't get used if you have myClass2 as another class.
Right, it does not get used in here. It will get used here.
Okay.
Because there's a div outside and myClass2 inside. Div outside, myClass2 inside.
Okay.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
The space means that it's an outside element. The inside elements are what comes after the space. And again, very much recommend that you read up on this outside of these slides. Obviously, I would say in most cases, you would have a lab on something like this at some point. I think that it is intended to be a prerequisite for this course that you have had labs on stuff like this, but I don't guess that's actually happened in a lot of cases. Okay, so next thing are the display types. So this is going to be somewhat confusing. Is anybody familiar with display types already? Block, display inline. All right. Okay, so every element on a web page has to interact with every other element on the page in some way. I mean, obviously, the placement of one element is going to dictate the placement of the next element because there's not room for them both to be in the same place, and we don't often see them just crashing over each other. We want to prevent that as much as possible. Typically, I mean, obviously there are some cases where you're looking for that. So we need to be aware of how the elements are being defined as far as their display type. And I'm just going to go to this because this is another really complicated topic. So a block level element always starts on a new line and takes up the full width available. Stretches out left and right as far as it can. Divs are like that. Forms are like that. Some of these semantic elements are like that. Header, footer, section. So what that means is if you have it as the only thing in the body, that div is going to stretch out left and right as far as it can, just like this one up here is. You can see the border around that, but only take up the vertical space that it requires. Other elements, inline elements, such as spans, A tags, image tags, are not on a new line, and they'll sit in the middle of something. So if you want to have a bit that is called out in the middle of a line, say there might be a paragraph tag around this, and then you have a span tag in here that you want to put a border around, you can do that. And then on the third level is display none, and that makes your visibility nothing. So that's a good way to show and hide things. Those display values can be overridden. So in some cases, you want a div to be inline, you can do that with CSS. You want an A tag to be a block, you can do that with CSS. There's also an inline block, which this doesn't seem to show, but I don't recommend that. It can get pretty complicated. There's also flex, display flex, and display grid are two new ways that you can display elements in CSS. They are cross-browser compatible at this point, and I mean, Flexbox and Grid both take some effort to get into and take some reading to get into, but man, they are powerful, and they can get some like really modern layouts done in a very fast way, very efficient way, and easy to develop and maintain. So I not for this class, but just again, assuming that you're going to continue to develop in the future, I recommend looking into Flexbox and CSS Grid sooner rather than later. Are there any questions on the display properties? Block makes it a block. Inline allows it to be inline. Display none means it's not displayed. Still can be very confusing, and can sort of be annoying when you're on a page and something isn't responding to you. You're telling it to be this width and it's not doing it. Well, it's because it's display inline. And they don't abide by the laws of physics. And then the final slide here is about CSS position. This is another large and complicated topic. Position property can be any of these: static, relative, fixed, absolute, and sticky. There are good examples of that. Here you can see down here in the bottom, we've got this div element has position fixed, so it's fixed down there to the bottom right. Static is always positioned according to the normal flow of the page, and this is the default positioning. There's relative positioning, which is relative to its normal position. So if it would have been here with position static, we can move it to the left or right by changing that position to relative and then setting left 30 pixels. And then that's going to offset it 30 pixels from the left. Does that make sense? Puts 30 pixels on the left of the thing. Position fixed is positioned relative to the viewport. So if you wanted to like put a modal over the window, position fixed is actually how a lot of those light boxes work. For project 2, if you wanted to put something like up in the center of the screen, you could do a position fixed, 50% across the screen. You could also use Flexbox for that. It'd be really easy to do if you want to look that up. And then position absolute is similar to position fixed, except instead of using the entire viewport as the area that it is positioning within, it's within the div or within the element that is directly above it. So rather than in position fixed, sorry, I confused myself. In position fixed, it skips all of the elements above the current one or outside of the current one and just positions it according to the viewport. In position absolute, it looks at the element that it is sitting inside of and then positions itself inside of that. And then sticky is awesome, but you know, fewer uses for that than the other ones. So yeah, just some more information about how that can be used. Oh, and z-index. I totally forgot about z-index. Z-index is a HTML feature that allows you to position a element in Z space. So if X and Y is left and right, or X is left and right, Y is up and down, Z space is, you know, into and out of your computer screen. So the lower the number, the further back it will be. The higher the number, the farther forward it will be. If you have two overlapping elements and you want to show one on top of the other, set the z-index of the one that's behind to a number that is higher than the z-index of the element that it's currently behind. Z-indexes are 0 by default. I'm pretty sure that's right. No, they don't have a z-index by default. You have to give it one. Multiple elements can be on the same z layer, so you could have a bunch of things on z0 and then a bunch of things on z1, and all of the things on z1 will show in front of all of the things on z0. Okay, and that concludes my, sort of run and gun CSS and JavaScript rundown. Are there any questions on anything that I talked about in there or anything else? Yes.
What was the thing you were talking about before positioning that you said was pretty good to look into?
The display types.
Display types.
Oh, and the ones that are good to look into, the ones that I was...
Or no, just
okay, yeah.
Like looking into display types is a good idea.
Definitely.
Yeah, okay.
And there are good examples out there that show them next to each other so you can get an idea, get a feel for it. CSS is definitely a thing that takes experience as much as anything else. You can learn it by reading about it, but there's so much. You just really have to do it and use it and try it and get frustrated with it, and be frustrated with it, and then accept that you'll be frustrated with it forever. That's just kind of how it works. Any other questions? Yeah.
In position. So depending on what you set the position as, like if you make like a left certain amount of pixels, is it in terms of whatever you set the position as? Like I'm kind of confused how like the position works with everything else.
Okay. Let's see. I'm going to tempt the demo gods here. See if we can't just make a sample file. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and do everything inline here. Okay, so we got that happening. I'm going to put in a non-breaking space here just so that there's something in there. Okay, so here we have a div with a non-breaking space in it with a border around it just so that we can see where it's at. As discussed, that has a default position. Oh no, no, that's bad news. My laptop is getting dangerously thirsty for energy here. That'd be all right. Do you have one? That'd be great.
That's what I'm here for.
Yeah. One of your many.
It's this. Yeah.
Yay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's just run through them in order. So static. And then here I can say top 0, right 0. And that, okay, we're working from my memory here, but I'm pretty sure that's going to put it in the top right. Or we'll do nothing. And this is where I was saying sometimes it's nicer, rather than going back and forth, to just inspect here.
You just right-click the element to inspect it?
Yeah, that's right. And then you can actually, if there are more, you can roll over and highlight them and see what elements those are. In Chrome, I don't know about Firefox and stuff, but I can actually add a new thing here. So I could say like color is bad example. Come on. There we go. So I can actually edit things on the page. Very handy. Okay.
Those changes aren't made to the page, right?
They are not made to the page. I would have to go copy them over somewhere to make that happen. Oh, I'm sorry. I said static. Static is the default one. Relative is the word that I'm looking for. So I actually changed nothing by making it static.
So static just
is what it is naturally.
Okay. So like it just keeps it no movement.
Right. It just becomes the next element placed on the page. And we have relative. My goodness. Demo God's not loving me right now. Oh, position relative to its normal position. Okay, so I gave it top and right 0, so there's no change. But if I give it a top of 10 px and a right of 20 px, you see that it moved. Can we not do that? You can see that that moved it down and over. And I can... if I take these off, you can see that they're, moving. If I edit it, it changes. The size of it doesn't change, just where does position change. Fixed. You can see there, we've got that fixed up at the top right, 10 px and 20 px from the origin there. And I could say width and alter that. So that's useful for certain things, although it's really of limited use.
So is the origin the top right of the screen?
Origin is top left, actually.
Oh, top left.
But,
Oh, yeah, that's right.
but because I had it set to top and right.
Oh, so it's set 20 pixels from the right?
That's correct.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
So, on my script, I also took this to another class to try to figure out what's wrong with the margins. But like Google Chrome kind of adds like this /webkit margin /padding. You know, get rid of that.
So all elements have a default set of margin and padding. I mean, that's like just part of the browser. But I can go in here and I could say margin 0, padding 0.
I've actually tried that in Star, HTML, and Body, setting all three of those margin and padding 0, but I still get this annoying amount of white space between everything.
Between everything?
Like between my header and that, like, it's really hard to explain. If you like came around and saw my website, then like,
We can definitely take a look at it. But typically margin and padding. And then there's a cool trick here, which you see. Do you see this thing here? This is actually showing me by color what is taking up my space. So if I add on here, this isn't going to like me because I'm position fixed. Or okay, wait. There we go. Okay, so if I look now, we can see that all of that to the right there is margin, right? And then everything to the left is something else. So whatever is taking up that space is going to be outside here. And you can see that margin there is going all the way to the outside. So if I wanted to get rid of that, this has got a margin 8 on it by default. I can give it a... But you said you did that. And there you go. I'm all the way off to the left now with no space between. So oftentimes something else is there that you're just like, dang it. And we'll figure it out. I'll help you figure it out. Yes.
So is that little box on the right side of the screen, that colored box, is that per element or is that the whole page?
It's per element. So if I, here, wait. Bad example. Okay. So I can look at anything on this. Just wanted something with a little more content. And I can say, you see, this has no margin, no padding on it. And I can go through here and I can see this form has a bit of padding all the way around it. And you can see, you can't really see, it's kind of small. You see that the padding is 15 pixels there. And that the internal dimensions of that are 500 by 841. So you can get a lot of information about what the position of your web page looks like by paying attention to that box. I use that box for a lot.
Okay.
Very, very handy. Very handy stuff. If I refresh, we'll go back to normal. We're back up at fixed. If I scroll down and go with absolute, I'm going to have to make another div outside of that. I mean, if I don't, it'll be just like the one before it. container div, and then I will and then I'm going to say height 500 pixels. I'm going to give it a border 1px solid 0, which will be green. And then if we go take a look, what's going on here? Does not like, oh, I've got an errant colon in there, so let's get that out. Okay, so there's my thing. You can see right now this is fixed, so if I scroll, it stays right where it is. But I'm going to change that to relative. I'm going to keep the proportions the same here, top and right 20. So what we're going to see is this thing pop into this area right here. Or not. Oh, because the width was specific to the page. So, but the top and right is exactly what you were expecting.
So what change did you make to make that happen?
I changed that from position fixed, which is relative to the whole viewport,
Right.
to position relative, which is relative to the element outside of this element. So if we actually, you see this element here is inside of this element.
Oh.
So it's relative to it.
So is the my class 1 position relative or container div relative?
My class 1 is relative to container div.
Okay.
And it has the position relative on it. My
Okay,
class
okay.
1 has the position relative on it.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
Which is nice, right? Because the outside element can be positioned as you like, and then the inside element will be on that part of the page, but where you want.
So then you have relative and then you have top and right. It's 10 pixels from the top and 20 pixels from the right.
That's right.
Relative to the
Containing div.
containing.
Right.
Okay.
Sounds good?
Yes.
Cool. And I mean, you see what I'm doing here, making these boxes and putting borders on them and just seeing how they go around. I mean, I still do this first. When I'm laying out a page, I make some HTML, make some CSS to just put boxes around things. I make sure everything is where I want it to be, and then I start building up inside of that. So I sort of start at the widest level and then go down to small levels and build it up, and then as I go through that, I end up with a full website. So we're done. And then sticky, I'm not going to bother with because I literally have never used it my whole life. But it's cool. It's a cool thing. Are there any questions? I can kind of feel that everybody's sort of dissipating. That's fine. I'm not criticizing. But if there are no more questions, you guys can. No, ask.
So do all classes and all elements all have like the same attributes? So like can you set like a h1 tag to have a style of top 0 and then have like a div tag of do they all share the same attributes?
They do all share the same attributes. The place where you're going to run into issues is display block and display inline. Those things are going to abide by width, etc. differently. But there's not an attribute that is specific to like a div that wouldn't work on a form or something like that. All elements are just elements as far as CSS is concerned. Yeah. Okay, are there any more questions about this? And then we'll go to that and anything else. Doesn't sound like it. What you got?
I just wanted to know for
Uh-huh.
Two things. Do we need any more than a username and a password for those?
I don't know off the top of my head. Would have to look. But we can look.
And then, would it be better for, in the register portion of it, where people sign up for accounts for that, would it be better if they could only sign up for the lowest account, or should they be able to sign up for all three versions?
I believe that there are instructions on that. I'm pretty sure a person can only sign up for the lowest account.
Okay.
And then it takes an admin to make the middle tier or the other admins.
So they already have to be higher.
Yes. I believe that is correct. Again, we should check the requirements to make sure. Are there any other questions about Project 2 or this stuff or anything? Okay, feel free to work on your, yes.
I have a question about my projects.
Okay, no, that's fine. And then, of course, if there are questions you'd like me to look at code, I know there are a couple of you. I will be going around and doing that. Okay, work on your stuff. I'll be here to help.